In the scorching heat of a remote military outpost, where the smell of diesel fuel mixed with desert sand and sweat, nobody expected salvation to come from the grease-stained hands of a quiet engine mechanic. When bullets started flying and Marines found themselves pinned down with nowhere to run, it wasn't the trained infantrymen or decorated officers who turned the tide of battle. It was Tommy Rodriguez, a 23-year-old kid from El Paso who could strip down a Humvee engine blindfolded but had never fired his weapon in anger. What happened next would defy every military manual ever written and prove that heroes don't always wear combat boots. Sometimes they wear coveralls and carry socket wrenches. This is the true story of how an ordinary Marine mechanic became a legend, when his brothers in arms had no cover left and death seemed certain. Tommy Rodriguez had always been more comfortable with machines than people. At Forward Operating Base Scorpion, a dusty outpost in the middle of nowhere, he spent his days elbow-deep in engine blocks, transmission cases, and hydraulic systems. While other Marines complained about the heat, the isolation, and the endless patrols, Tommy found peace in the mechanical rhythm of his work. The motor pool was his sanctuary, a place where problems had solutions and everything made sense if you knew how to look at it right. The base sat like a concrete island in an ocean of tan sand and jagged rocks. 300 Marines called it home, though most would have chosen different words to describe the place. The perimeter was lined with concrete barriers, razor wire, and guard towers that baked in the relentless sun. Inside, prefabricated buildings housed everything from command centers to mess halls, connected by dusty roads that never seemed to stay clean no matter how often they were swept. Tommy's world revolved around the motor pool, a collection of maintenance bays, parts storage, and vehicle parking that sprawled across the eastern edge of the base. Here, Humvees, trucks, and armored vehicles came to be healed. Some arrived with bullet holes, others with blown transmissions or fried electrical systems. Tommy treated them all with the same methodical care, diagnosing problems with the patience of a doctor and the precision of a surgeon. At 23, Tommy looked younger than his years, with dark hair that stuck up at odd angles despite military regulations and grease stains that seemed permanently embedded under his fingernails. He had joined the Marines straight out of high school, not because he wanted to be a warrior, but because the recruiter had promised him training in automotive technology. His plan was simple: serve his time, learn everything he could about engines, and then go home to El Paso to open his own repair shop. The other Marines in his unit respected Tommy's skills, but they didn't really know him. He was quiet during meals, kept to himself during downtime, and rarely joined the card games or discussions that filled the evening hours. When pressed, he would smile and make some excuse about needing to finish a repair or catch up on maintenance logs. The truth was simpler. Tommy felt more at home with the honest complexity of mechanical systems than with the unpredictable nature of human relationships. Sergeant Mike Chen, the motor pool supervisor, had quickly learned to rely on Tommy's expertise. Chen was a career Marine, a tough Korean-American from San Francisco who had served 3 combat deployments and earned respect through competence and fairness. He recognized Tommy's gift for diagnosis and repair, often assigning him the most challenging jobs, while newer mechanics handled routine maintenance. "Rodriguez has magic hands," Chen would tell visiting officers. "Give him a busted transmission and a box of parts, and he'll have it purring like a kitten by morning." Tommy's reputation extended beyond the motor pool. Infantry squads would specifically request that he work on their vehicles before important missions. They trusted him to ensure their rides would get them there and back safely. For Tommy, this trust was both an honor and a burden. He understood that his work was literally a matter of life and death, and he approached every repair with that weight on his shoulders. The base's daily routine had become as predictable as clockwork. Reveille at 0500, morning formation at 0530, chow at 0600. Tommy would be in the motor pool by 0700, often staying until well after evening mess. His workbench was meticulously organized, tools arranged by size and function, parts catalogs dog-eared and annotated with his own notes. He had developed his own diagnostic procedures, shortcuts that weren't in any manual but consistently delivered results. Staff Sergeant Williams, the company's senior enlisted man, had noticed Tommy's dedication but worried about his isolation. Williams was a massive man from Alabama, built like a linebacker with a voice that could carry across a parade ground. He had tried several times to draw Tommy into the social fabric of the unit, inviting him to join PT sessions, poker games, and off-duty discussions. Tommy always declined politely, claiming he had work to finish. "That boy's wound tighter than a watch spring," Williams confided to Sergeant Chen one evening. "Good Marine, Hell of a mechanic, but he keeps himself locked up like Fort Knox. Chen nodded, understanding William's concern. He opens up when he's working. You should see him training the new guys. Different person entirely. It was true. When teaching younger Marines about engine repair or electrical systems, Tommy became animated and patient, sharing knowledge with genuine enthusiasm. He had developed training methods that made complex concepts accessible, using analogies and hands-on demonstrations that stuck with his students long after the formal instruction ended. But once the work stopped, he would retreat back into his shell, polite but distant. The base had seen its share of excitement over the past few months. Mortar rounds had fallen inside the perimeter twice, causing minor damage but no casualties. Patrol units reported increased activity in the surrounding area, with intelligence suggesting that enemy forces were probing for weaknesses. The threat level had been elevated, guard rotations increased, and everyone reminded to maintain constant vigilance. Tommy absorbed these developments with the same methodical approach he applied to engine problems. He began carrying his service weapon more consistently, checked and rechecked the readiness status of all vehicles, and even started participating in some of the informal combat drills that occurred during downtime. But his focus remained primarily on his mechanical responsibilities. The motor pool had become critical to the base's defensive posture. With increased patrol schedules and the need to maintain rapid response capability, vehicle readiness was more important than ever. Tommy found himself working longer hours, sometimes catching only a few hours of sleep before the next day's demands began. But he never complained, viewing the increased workload as just another problem to be solved through organization and effort. On quiet evenings, when the desert cooled and the base settled into its nighttime routine, Tommy would sometimes climb onto the roof of the main maintenance bay. From there, he could see the entire compound spread out below, guard towers silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and the endless expanse of desert beyond the perimeter. These moments of solitude gave him perspective on his place in the larger mission, though he still saw himself primarily as a support player rather than a combat participant. His fellow Marines had begun to notice subtle changes in Tommy's behavior. He seemed more alert during security briefings, asked more questions about patrol routes and threat assessments, and had started making suggestions about vehicle positioning and maintenance schedules that demonstrated tactical thinking beyond his technical expertise. Sergeant Chen attributed this to natural maturation and increased responsibility, not realizing that Tommy was unconsciously preparing himself for challenges that his analytical mind sensed coming. The base's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Morrison, had been tracking enemy activity patterns and growing increasingly concerned about the concentration of hostile forces in the area. Morrison was a young officer, fresh from intelligence school, but smart enough to recognize patterns that others might miss. His reports indicated that the base was likely being observed and that an attack was not a matter of if, but when. Tommy's mechanical expertise had inadvertently made him privy to more intelligence than most enlisted men received. Officers would discuss operational details while he worked on their vehicles, assuming that his focus on technical matters meant he wasn't really listening. But Tommy absorbed everything, filing away information about patrol schedules, supply runs, and defensive preparations with the same systematic approach he used to catalog parts and procedures. The night before everything changed, Tommy had worked late installing a new cooling system in a Humvee scheduled for an early morning supply run. As he cleaned his tools and secured the motor pool, he noticed unusual activity around the command center. Officers were coming and going at irregular hours, and radio chatter seemed more intense than usual. His mechanical mind recognized the pattern as similar to the increased activity that preceded major maintenance operations. Systematic preparation for something significant. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams of engines that wouldn't start and repair jobs that couldn't be completed. Tommy woke before reveille, feeling unsettled, though he couldn't identify the source of his unease. He dressed quickly and made his way to the motor pool, finding comfort in the familiar routine of checking vehicle status and reviewing the day's scheduled maintenance tasks. The morning briefing contained nothing unusual: routine patrols, scheduled maintenance, and standard security protocols. But Tommy noticed that several officers exchanged glances that suggested they knew more than they were sharing. His analytical mind filed this observation away with dozens of others, building a mental picture of a situation that was more complex than it appeared on the surface. As the day progressed, Tommy's sense of unease grew stronger. Small details seemed out of place. Guard rotations that didn't match the posted schedule, supply deliveries that arrived earlier than expected, and radio checks that occurred more frequently than normal. To most Marines, these would have been insignificant variations in routine. But Tommy's systematic mind recognized them as symptoms of a larger pattern. Pieces of a puzzle he couldn't quite assemble. The final piece fell into place when Sergeant Chen approached him just after noon with an unusual request. Chen wanted all vehicles topped off with fuel, weapon systems checked, and communication equipment tested. Essentially a full readiness inspection disguised as routine maintenance. The order came with no explanation, but Tommy understood its implications immediately. Something was coming to forward operating base Scorpion, and his quiet world of engines and repair manuals was about to be shattered forever. The first mortar round landed at 13:47 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, when the desert heat made everything shimmer like a mirage. Tommy was underneath the Humvee, replacing a leaking oil pan gasket, when the explosion threw dirt and debris across the motor pool. The blast wave rattled through the ground and into his chest, a sensation he felt more than heard. For a split second, his mechanical mind processed the vibration pattern, categorizing it as something far more serious than the backfire of a diesel engine. The second round hit 30 seconds later, closer this time, shattering windows in the parts storage building and sending Marines scrambling for cover. Tommy rolled out from under the Humvee, his coveralls streaked with oil and sand, just as the base alarm began its urgent wail. The sound cut through the afternoon heat like a blade, transforming the lazy summer day into something altogether more dangerous. Incoming! Incoming! All personnel to battle stations. The announcement echoed across the compound from speakers mounted on utility poles, barely audible over the growing chaos. Marines erupted from buildings like ants from a disturbed hill, running toward predetermined defensive positions with the fluid efficiency that came from months of drill and preparation. Tommy's first instinct was to secure the motor pool. He sprinted toward the main maintenance bay, dodging Marines headed in the opposite direction. His mind automatically cataloging the vehicles that needed to be protected and the fuel storage areas that represented potential fire hazards. But before he could reach the building, a third mortar round exploded in the compound's center near the mess hall, and the shockwave knocked him off his feet. Rolling to his knees, Tommy looked up to see Sergeant Chen running toward him, weapon in hand and wearing full combat gear. Chen's face was grim but controlled, the expression of a professional soldier transitioning from peacetime routine to wartime reality. "Rodriguez, get to the armory and draw your weapon and gear," Chen shouted over the noise of another incoming round. "We're under attack." Tommy nodded and sprinted toward the armory, joining a stream of Marines moving with urgent purpose. The armory sergeant was distributing weapons and ammunition with mechanical efficiency, checking names against rosters and ensuring everyone received their assigned equipment. Tommy's hand shook slightly as he signed for his M16A4 rifle magazines and protective gear, but his voice remained steady. As he strapped on his flak jacket and helmet, Tommy's analytical mind began processing the tactical situation. The mortar attacks were coming from multiple directions, suggesting a coordinated assault by a substantial force. The timing coincided with the afternoon shift change, when guard rotations created brief windows of reduced vigilance. Someone had been watching the base carefully, studying their patterns and waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The motor pool sat on the eastern edge of the compound, adjacent to the main gate and overlooking the access road that connected the base to the outside world. From his position, Tommy could see muzzle flashes in the rocky hills beyond the perimeter, confirming that the attack involved direct fire weapons in addition to mortars. The enemy had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that would make movement across the compound extremely dangerous. "All Marines to defensive positions. This is not a drill." Staff Sergeant Williams's voice boomed across the base communication system. "Repeat, all Marines to defensive positions." Tommy's assigned battle station was Tower 3, a concrete guard post on the southeastern corner of the perimeter. But as he moved toward his position, he realized that several Marines were trapped in the compound's center by accurate sniper fire. Every time someone tried to cross the open areas between buildings, bullets would crack through the air, forcing them back to cover. Private Johnson, a 19-year-old kid from Montana who worked in the communications section, was pinned behind a concrete barrier near the command center. Blood stained his uniform shirt, and his face showed the pale shock of someone experiencing combat for the first time. He had been trying to reach the radio room when the attack began, carrying message traffic that now seemed insignificant compared to his immediate survival. "I can't move!" Johnson called out to anyone who might be listening. "They've got the whole area covered." Tommy crouched behind a supply truck and assessed the situation with the same methodical approach he used for complex mechanical problems. The enemy had established interlocking fields of fire that created kill zones across the compound's main thoroughfares. Traditional infantry tactics would require coordinated movement and covering fire, But the Marines were scattered and still organizing their response. The motor pool offered a different perspective on the tactical problem. From his position, Tommy could see enemy muzzle flashes in the hills and track their approximate positions. More importantly, he could see the blind spots in their coverage, areas where the rocky terrain and distance made accurate fire difficult. His mechanical mind began calculating angles and distances, treating the battlefield like a complex engine problem that required the right combination of components to function properly. Another mortar round exploded near the mess hall, followed immediately by sustained automatic weapons fire from at least 3 different positions. The enemy was pressing their attack, trying to overwhelm the base's defenses before the Marines could organize an effective response. Radio chatter filled the air as squad leaders tried to coordinate their scattered personnel and establish communication with higher headquarters. Tommy's radio crackled with urgent transmissions. Tower 1, report your status. Medical team to the command center. Anyone have eyes on the eastern approach? The voices were tense but professional, Marines doing their jobs under the worst possible circumstances. As he listened to the radio traffic, Tommy realized that the attack was more sophisticated than a simple mortar barrage. The enemy had infiltrated close enough to observe the base's defensive positions and time their assault to achieve maximum disruption. They knew about guard schedules, shift changes, and the location of critical facilities. This wasn't a random attack. It was a carefully planned operation designed to destroy forward operating base Scorpion. Rodriguez, where are you? Sergeant Chen's voice came through Tommy's radio headset. We need you at the motor pool. Some of the vehicles took shrapnel damage, and we need to know what's still operational. Tommy keyed his radio and responded. Moving to the motor pool now, Sergeant. I can see enemy positions in the eastern hills. Copy that. Be careful moving across the compound. We've got snipers with good fields of fire. Tommy began moving toward the motor pool using whatever cover was available. Concrete barriers, parked vehicles, and building walls. The enemy fire was intensifying, with bullets striking metal surfaces and concrete walls with sharp cracks that echoed across the compound. Somewhere behind him, he could hear Marines returning fire from defensive positions, the familiar sound of M16 rifles mixing with the heavier chatter of squad automatic weapons. The motor pool had taken several direct hits from mortar rounds and small arms fire. One of the maintenance bays had a gaping hole in its roof, and shattered glass covered the floor like deadly confetti. Several vehicles showed fresh damage, bullet holes in doors and windows, shrapnel scars in metal panels, and at least one Humvee, with a flat tire and damaged windshield. But Tommy's attention was drawn to something else entirely. The main fuel storage tank, a large cylindrical container that supplied diesel fuel for all base vehicles, had been punctured by shrapnel and was slowly leaking its contents onto the ground. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with concrete dust and gunpowder created an acrid combination that burned his nostrils and reminded him of the potential for catastrophic fire. Moving quickly, Tommy located the emergency shutoff valve for the fuel system and closed it, stopping the leak before it could create a larger hazard. Then he began a rapid assessment of vehicle damage, checking engines, fuel systems, and communication equipment to determine what was still operational. His hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the chaos around him, muscle memory taking over, while his conscious mind processed the tactical situation. The radio crackled with increasingly urgent transmissions. We're taking heavy fire from the east. Need medical evacuation at Building 6. Tower 2 is not responding.
Tommy realized that the base's defensive positions were being systematically suppressed by accurate sniper fire.
The enemy had done their homework, identifying key positions and targeting them with precision weapons that kept Marines pinned down and unable to coordinate an effective response. Without mobility and communication, the defenders were fighting as individuals rather than as a cohesive unit. His mechanical mind began working on the problem from a different angle. The enemy positions in the eastern hills were approximately 800 meters from the base perimeter, close enough for accurate rifle fire, but far enough to make them difficult targets for the base's defensive weapons. However, the motor pool contained several vehicles with mounted weapon systems, .50 caliber machine guns, and automatic grenade launchers that had much longer effective ranges than individual rifles. Tommy keyed his radio and contacted Sergeant Chen. Sergeant, I've got 3 vehicles here that are operational and have mounted weapons. The Humvee with the Mark 19 grenade launcher could reach those enemy positions in the hills. There was a pause before Chen responded, his voice tense with concentration. Rodriguez, are you qualified on crew-served weapons? Tommy hesitated. His training had covered basic operation of vehicle-mounted weapons, but he had never fired them in combat. His expertise was in maintenance and repair, not employment. But as he watched Marines trapped by enemy fire and listened to increasingly desperate radio calls for support, His analytical mind recognized that technical knowledge might be more important than combat experience.
I can operate the systems, Sergeant.
I've maintained them and know how they function. Another long pause, filled with the sound of gunfire and explosions. Finally, Chen's voice came back. Do it, Rodriguez. We need to suppress those positions so our people can move. Tommy ran to the Humvee equipped with the Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher, a weapon system he had serviced dozens of times but never fired. The vehicle had taken some shrapnel damage to its windshield and passenger door, but the engine started immediately and the weapon appeared undamaged. His hands moved automatically through the startup procedures, checking ammunition feed, clearing the firing mechanism, and testing the electrical systems. The Mark 19 was a belt-fed weapon that fired 40 MMS grenades at a rate of up to 400 rounds per minute. Its effective range was nearly 2 kilometers, more than enough to reach the enemy positions in the hills. But using it effectively required understanding trajectory, target identification, and ammunition selection. Technical knowledge that Tommy possessed but had never applied in combat. As he positioned the Humvee to engage the enemy positions, Tommy's radio filled with urgent calls from Marines across the compound. We're still pinned down at Building 4. Can't reach the wounded at the gate. Need covering fire to move medical supplies. Tommy took a deep breath, applied everything he knew about the weapon system's operation, and prepared to discover whether his mechanical expertise could translate into combat effectiveness. The quiet mechanic who had spent his days fixing engines and avoiding confrontation was about to become the base's most critical defensive asset. The first grenade left the launcher with a distinctive thump, arcing through the desert air toward a muzzle flash Tommy had spotted in the Rocky Hills. He watched its flight path, calculating adjustments for range and windage the same way he would calibrate any precision instrument. The explosion bloomed orange and black against the tan landscape, close enough to the target to indicate that his calculations were correct. Tommy adjusted his aim slightly and fired a burst of 3 rounds, walking the grenades across the suspected enemy position. The explosions echoed off the hills and sent up clouds of dust and debris. Almost immediately, the sniper fire from that location stopped. Good shooting, Rodriguez. Sergeant Chen's voice crackled through the radio. Keep it up. But Tommy was already shifting his attention to the next enemy position, his mechanical mind processing the complex ballistics problem while his hands worked the weapon controls with growing confidence. For the first time since the attack began, forward operating base Scorpion was fighting back effectively. The transition from defensive fire to offensive action happened gradually, like the smooth acceleration of a well-tuned engine. Tommy found himself thinking in mechanical terms even as he directed 40 grenades towards enemy positions scattered across the eastern hills. Each shot was a calculation, a problem to be solved through the application of technical knowledge and systematic observation. The Mark 19 grenade launcher responded to his commands with mechanical precision, and Tommy began to understand why his fellow Marines had always trusted him to make their vehicles work properly. The enemy had not expected effective counterfire from the motor pool. Their assault plan had assumed that the base's defensive weapons would be concentrated in the guard towers and perimeter bunkers, not mounted on vehicles parked in what should have been a support area. Tommy's unconventional position gave him angles of fire that could reach enemy locations invisible to the traditional defensive positions. Rodriguez, you're breaking up their coordination. Staff Sergeant Williams's voice boomed through the radio net. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Tommy keyed his radio while keeping his eyes on the hills. I can see at least 4 more positions with muzzle flashes. They're using the rocks for cover, but the Mark 19 can reach them. You're cleared to engage any target you can identify, Williams responded. We're starting to get our people moving again. Indeed, across the compound, Tommy could see Marines beginning to emerge from cover and move toward their assigned positions. The suppression of enemy sniper fire had broken the tactical paralysis that had gripped the base during the initial assault. Squad leaders were reorganizing their personnel. Medical teams were reaching wounded Marines, and communication between defensive positions was improving. But Tommy also realized that his actions had made him a priority target. Bullets began impacting around his vehicle with increasing frequency, and he could hear the distinctive crack of high-velocity rounds passing close to his position. The enemy had identified the source of the effective counterfire and was concentrating their efforts on eliminating it. A sniper's bullet shattered the Humvee's side mirror, sending glass fragments across Tommy's face and drawing a thin line of blood along his cheek. The shot had missed his head by inches, close enough that he could feel the shockwave from the bullet's passage. His hands remained steady on the weapon controls, but his mind calculated that he had perhaps minutes before Accurate enemy fire would force him to abandon his position. The solution came to him with the same clarity he experienced when diagnosing a complex mechanical problem. Instead of remaining stationary and allowing the enemy to zero in on his position, he could use the motor pool's collection of operational vehicles to create a mobile firing platform. By moving between different vehicles and firing positions, he could maintain suppressive fire while making himself a more difficult target. Tommy quickly drove the Humvee to a new position behind the main maintenance bay, using the building for cover while maintaining sight lines to the enemy positions. The move took less than 30 seconds, but it disrupted the enemy's targeting solution and forced them to reacquire his location. Meanwhile, he continued engaging suspected sniper nests with measured bursts of grenades. His radio crackled with situation reports from across the compound. Eastern perimeter is holding. Medical team has reached all wounded personnel. Tower 1 reports enemy movement on the northern approach. The tactical picture was becoming clearer. The initial assault had been designed to pin down the base's defenders and create chaos, possibly as a prelude to a ground assault, or simply to inflict maximum casualties. But Tommy's unexpected intervention had disrupted the enemy's timeline and allowed the Marines to stabilize their defensive positions. Sergeant Chen's voice came through the radio with urgent precision. "Rodriguez, we've got enemy infantry moving up the eastern approach road. Can you shift fire to engage them?" Tommy repositioned his vehicle to get sight lines on the road leading to the base's main gate. Through his weapon sight, he could see approximately 15 enemy fighters moving in tactical formation, using roadside cover and advancing by fire and movement. They were still 800 meters out, but clearly intended to assault the base perimeter once they reached effective range. The Mark 19 was ideally suited for this target. Its high explosive grenades could engage personnel in the open at ranges far beyond those of individual weapons, and its rapid rate of fire could quickly saturate an area with lethal fragmentation. Tommy calculated range and trajectory, accounting for the slight downward angle from his elevated position in the motor pool. His first burst of grenades landed short, kicking up dust and debris but not achieving direct hits. Tommy adjusted his aim upward and fired again, walking the explosions up the road toward the advancing enemy formation. The second burst was more accurate, and he saw several enemy fighters go down or scramble for better cover. The enemy infantry response was immediate and intense. Automatic weapons fire began impacting around Tommy's position with increasing accuracy, forcing him to button up inside the Humvee's armored compartment. Bullets sparked off metal surfaces and cracked through the air with sharp reports that indicated high-velocity rifle rounds. But Tommy had gained something more valuable than tactical advantage. He had bought time for the base's defensive systems to organize and respond. Guard towers that had been suppressed by sniper fire were now engaging targets with their mounted machine guns. Mortar teams were setting up indirect fire missions to engage enemy positions beyond the range of direct fire weapons. The base was transitioning from a reactive defensive posture to coordinated counterattacks. All stations, this is base defense control," came a new voice on the radio net. "We have air support inbound, ETA 15 minutes. Mark your positions and prepare to designate targets." Tommy felt a surge of relief mixed with continued adrenaline. Air support would fundamentally change the tactical balance, giving the defenders the ability to engage enemy positions at extended ranges with precision weapons. But 15 minutes was still a long time in combat, and the enemy would likely press their assault before aircraft arrived on station. His prediction proved accurate. The enemy infantry on the eastern approach began advancing more aggressively, using smoke grenades to conceal their movement and concentrating their fire on the base's defensive positions. Mortar rounds began falling inside the perimeter again, indicating that the enemy had repositioned their indirect fire assets to support the ground assault. Tommy realized that his mobile firing position gave him unique advantages in this evolving tactical situation. While the base's fixed defensive positions were limited by their fields of fire and the enemy's knowledge of their locations, he could move throughout the motor pool and engage targets from unexpected angles. His mechanical expertise allowed him to quickly transition between different vehicles and weapon systems, maximizing his tactical flexibility. He moved to a second Humvee equipped with a .50 caliber machine gun, a weapon system with longer effective range and better accuracy against point targets. The enemy infantry was now close enough that he could see individual fighters through his weapon sight, and the .50 caliber rounds would be more effective than grenades against personnel in covered positions. The big machine gun fired with a steady rhythm that Tommy found oddly comforting, each shot precisely aimed and purposeful. He had never considered himself a warrior, but the mechanical precision of aimed fire appealed to his systematic nature. Each trigger pull was a problem solved. Each target engaged was a component adjusted to achieve proper system function. His fire was devastatingly effective. The .50 caliber rounds could penetrate light cover and disable enemy weapons at ranges where return fire was less accurate. Tommy watched enemy fighters scramble for new positions or withdraw entirely as his heavy bullets impacted around their locations with mechanical regularity. "Outstanding shooting, Rodriguez," came Williams's voice through the radio. "You're breaking up their assault." But Tommy was already processing the next problem in the tactical sequence. Enemy mortar fire was increasing in accuracy and intensity, suggesting that forward observers were adjusting fires based on observed impacts. The motor pool, while offering tactical advantages, was also becoming a target of increasing enemy attention. A mortar round exploded 30 meters away, close enough to shower Tommy's position with concrete fragments and metal shrapnel. The blast wave rattled through his chest and reminded him that his exposed position made him vulnerable to indirect fire. But moving to a more protected position would reduce his ability to engage the advancing enemy infantry. Tommy's mechanical mind solved the problem by treating it as a timing issue, like synchronizing the firing sequence in a complex engine. He would engage targets aggressively for brief periods, then move to new positions before enemy fires could be adjusted to his location. By maintaining constant movement and using the motor pool's collection of vehicles as cover, he could sustain effective fire while minimizing his exposure to counter-battery fire. The next 20 minutes became a deadly dance of movement, engagement, and repositioning. Tommy moved between different vehicles and weapon systems, engaging enemy positions with whatever weapon was most appropriate for each target. Grenades for enemy infantry in the open, machine gun fire for point targets, and quick displacement before enemy fires could be effectively adjusted. His radio filled with updates on the tactical situation. Northern perimeter reports enemy probing attacks. Medical evacuation helicopter inbound for casualties. Air support checking in on station. The sound of jet engines overhead marked a fundamental shift in the battle's momentum. F-16 Fighting Falcons began making low passes over the enemy positions, dropping precision-guided munitions on targets designated by ground controllers. The explosions in the eastern hills were massive and final, eliminating enemy positions that had been harassing the base for the past hour. But even as air support dominated the distant targets, Tommy continued engaging enemy infantry that had advanced close to the base perimeter. These fighters were too close to the friendly positions for safe employment of air-delivered weapons, making them the responsibility of the ground defenders. Tommy's final engagement of the day came when a small group of enemy fighters attempted to breach the eastern gate using explosives and automatic weapons. From his position in the motor pool, he had a clear shot at the assault team as they approached the perimeter fence. His .50 caliber machine gun fire was precise and effective, stopping the assault before it could reach the gate and eliminating the immediate threat to the base's integrity. As the afternoon sun began to sink towards the western horizon, the intensity of enemy fire gradually decreased. Airstrikes had eliminated the distant mortar positions and sniper nests, while the base's ground defenders had repelled all attempts at close assault. Radio traffic shifted from urgent combat reports to administrative communications about casualty evacuation, damage assessment, and resupply requirements. Tommy finally allowed himself to step away from his weapon and survey the motor pool. Several vehicles showed fresh battle damage from enemy fire, and one maintenance bay would require significant repair work. But the critical fuel storage systems were intact, and most vehicles remained operational. From a logistical standpoint, the motor pool had survived the assault in good condition. Sergeant Chen appeared at Tommy's side, his face showing a mixture of relief and admiration. "Rodriguez, I don't know what to say. You probably saved half the Marines on this base today." Tommy looked around at the evidence of combat-spent brass casings scattered around his fighting positions, impact marks from enemy bullets, and the acrid smell of gunpowder mixed with diesel fuel. It seemed surreal that his quiet world of mechanical repair had been transformed into a battlefield where his technical knowledge had become a weapon. "I just did what needed to be done, Sergeant," Tommy replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "Same as fixing an engine. You identify the problem and apply the right tools to solve it." Chen shook his head with something approaching amazement. "Most Marines train their whole careers to do what you did today. You turned yourself into a one-man fire support team and held off an entire assault." As the immediate tactical situation stabilized, Tommy began the process of transitioning back to his normal role. Vehicles needed post-combat inspections, weapon systems required cleaning and maintenance, and damage assessments had to be completed before normal operations could resume. But even as he returned to familiar mechanical tasks, Tommy understood that something fundamental had changed. The quiet mechanic who had preferred engines to people had discovered that his analytical mind and systematic approach could be applied to problems far more complex than automotive repair. When his fellow Marines had found themselves with no cover left and death closing in, Tommy Rodriguez had opened fire from the motor pool and proven that heroes sometimes emerge from the most unexpected places. Staff Sergeant Williams found Tommy an hour later, methodically cleaning the .50 caliber machine gun that had served him so well during the battle. Williams watched silently as Tommy disassembled the weapon with the same careful attention he applied to engine components, checking each part for wear or damage before reassembly. "You know, Rodriguez," Williams said finally, "I've been wrong about you. Thought you were just a quiet kid who liked working on engines. Turns out you're a quiet kid who likes solving problems. And today the biggest problem was keeping us all alive." Tommy looked up from his work, grease-stained hands still steady despite everything he had been through. "Every problem has a solution, Staff Sergeant. You just have to understand the system well enough to know which tools to use." Williams nodded, understanding that Tommy's mechanical metaphors were his way of processing experiences that defied normal description. "Well, you sure picked the right tools today, and you used them like a professional." As evening approached and the base settled into heightened security routine, Tommy completed his post-combat maintenance tasks and prepared for what he expected would be a long debriefing process. Military bureaucracy would want detailed reports, ammunition expenditure accounts, and damage assessments. But for now, in the quiet hours after combat, Tommy found himself thinking about the Marines whose lives had been saved by his intervention. He had joined the Corps to learn about engines, planning to serve his time quietly and return home with marketable skills. Instead, he had discovered capabilities he never knew he possessed, and had proven that technical expertise could be as valuable as traditional warrior skills when applied with intelligence and determination. The Desert Knight fell over forward operating base Scorpion with the same relentless certainty as always, but the base itself had been forever changed by the day's events. In the motor pool, surrounded by vehicles that bore fresh scars from combat, Tommy Rodriguez continued the quiet work of maintenance and repair. But now everyone knew that when the shooting started and Marines found themselves with no cover left, the engine mechanic would open fire from the motor pool and fight with the precision of a master craftsman applying his tools to save lives. The legend of the quiet mechanic had begun, built not on bravado or dramatic gestures, but on the simple application of systematic thinking and technical knowledge to the most critical problem any Marine could face: keeping his brothers alive when everything else had failed. "No cover left," the Marines cried. Then the engine mechanic opened fire from the motor pool,